China has put new tariffs on U.S. goods, trying to force the U.S. to back down in the trade war. But Trump says, "I'll see you and raise you 5%. And now he's calling on U.S. companies to leave China. Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. The Chinese Communist Party is not happy about the U.S.'s latest tariffs on Chinese goods. So they've launched new tariffs of their own, of up to 10% on $75 billion worth of U.S. goods. That was announced last Friday, and it came after the U.S. unveiled tariffs on an additional $300 billion of Chinese goods scheduled to go into effect in two stages, one in September and the other in December. And the Chinese regime's new tariffs play on people's fears of a recession ahead of the 2020 election. They want to make President Trump blink. But they forgot they were dealing with Tariff Man. Trump had tweeted on Friday saying he would not only not withdraw the planned tariffs in response to China, but that he would levy even more tariffs on Chinese goods. And he told reporters that night,
"We're having a little spat with China, and we'll win it. We put a lot of tariffs on China today. As you know, they put some on us. We put a lot on them."
And then Trump was off to attend the G7 summit in France. On Monday, he gave a colorful explanation for the logic of why China's one-upmanship in piling on tariffs is doomed to fail.
When I raise and he raises, I raise and he raises, we can never catch up. We have to balance our trading relationship, at least to an extent. And they were unwilling to do that. And we'll never have a deal if that happens.
One of the ways the U.S.-China trade relationship is unbalanced is the $420 billion trade deficit with China. In 2018, the U.S. exported only $120 billion worth of goods to China, while imports from China were $540 billion. But if this was just a trade imbalance problem, then it would be easy to solve. China could just buy more pork and soybeans from the U.S. and everyone would go home happy. Except for this little guy. Bacon. Which is to say, it's not just a trade imbalance problem. According to the U.S. Trade Representative, China steals up to $600 billion per year in American intellectual property. This is done in part through state-sponsored corporate espionage and cyber attacks. It's also done through forced technology transfers, where the Chinese regime forces foreign companies doing business in China to hand over intellectual property and licenses. Chinese state-run media has responded to these allegations by accusing the U.S. of using intellectual property as a weapon to contain other countries and a veil for bullying the world. So China is stealing from the U.S. The U.S. is complaining about China stealing from the U.S. And now China is saying, "Quit bullying us for stealing from you." Sounds reasonable. Trump said at Monday's G7 summit that if China doesn't start treating the U.S. fairly, he's willing to stop doing business with China entirely.
You know, and I told this to President Xi, who I really respect, I really do. But I told him very strongly, I said, look, you're starting up here, and you're making $500 billion a year and stealing our intellectual property. We're down on the floor, lower than the floor. You can't make a 50-50 deal. This has to be a deal that's better for us. And if it's not better, let's not do business together. I don't want to do business. Forget about tariffs for a second. We're taking in tremendous amounts of money. Forget that. I don't want to do business.
The Chinese regime, meanwhile, said it would fight back against American tariffs. The Communist Party's mouthpiece, the People's Daily, said in an editorial on Sunday that China is confident that it will follow its own path and do its own things well, and will never waver in its stand on countering any provocations by the U.S. side. But despite Trump's assurances that he and Xi Jinping are still pals, one person who sees their bromance crumbling is former White House chief strategist Steve Bannon.
I'm glad we're having this interview today on Friday, because I think the friendship, quote unquote, with President Xi and President Trump probably ended today when China came back and tried to play smash mouth.
Does he mean the Chinese regime is dropping hints that if Trump doesn't follow, there won't be a tomorrow?
If you follow, there may be a tomorrow, but if we are the shun, you might as well be walking on the sun.
Remember when bowling shirts were cool? Me neither. But anyway, the Trump-Xi Jinping bromance notwithstanding, Trump said he's ordering U.S. companies to immediately start looking for an alternative to China, including bringing their companies home and making their products in the USA, leading American media to ask, wait, can he do that? Trump answered that question, telling all the fake news reporters who doubted him that yes, he can, using the Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977. Case closed. Wait, so he can do that? Well, yes, but it's complicated. The 1977 law gives the president the power to block financial transactions between a U.S. company and a specific foreign country, i.e., China. So if Trump enacted that power, it would effectively prevent U.S. companies from conducting business with China. But Trump cannot specifically force those companies to move their manufacturing to the U.S., because they can just move to other countries with low labor costs. In fact, they've been gradually doing that already over the past year, relocating factories from China to Southeast Asia. See, it's important for big companies to pay their workers as little as possible, even if they can't do it in China. At least until the robots take everyone's jobs. So what do you think about Trump's response to China's tariffs? Leave your comments below. And now, it's time for me to answer a question from one of my 50 Cent Army supporters on Patreon. Sel asks, there's a lot of talk about the potential for the CCP/Chinese economy to collapse under all this pressure. But with how much the global economy is intertwined with China, could the rest of the world survive such a collapse? Wouldn't that qualify as an economic version of mutually assured destruction? Good question, Sel. If China's giant economy collapses, the entire world will feel the ground shake. It could crash stock markets globally and lead to another global financial crisis. However, the less tied the U.S. is to China, the less the U.S. would feel it. That's part of the reason why the Trump administration wants U.S. companies to pull out of China. It protects the U.S. economy against a possible disaster there. So really, smart companies ought to pull out as soon as possible. Thanks for your question. Be like Sel and support China Uncensored on Patreon. We rely mainly on viewer support to make this show. Once again, I'm your host, Chris Chappell. See you next time.